Tonight our speaker is Jim Parco. He's faculty at Colorado College, a former member of the faculty at the Air Force Academy, and he's talking tonight about For God and Country, religious fundamentalism in the U.S. military. Please welcome Jim Parco.
Rob, remind me to plug that ice machine back in. I just it was so noisy, so we got a lot.
Okay, totally fine.
Thank you for having me. I'm Jim Parco. I am just curious, anybody in here in the audience former military? Okay, that's good. To give some kind of context. Before I get started, I want to thank Groff for having me in tonight. I met Becky a couple months back, and she was the one that suggested that I think about doing this, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity. For those of you who don't know, Becky's also the national president of the American Hymns Association. So Becky's kind of a big deal, and she's doing some really good work. So thank you. I also need to make sure I acknowledge the work of Mikey Weinstein and his foundation, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. You're going to see I've got a very close connection with the Weinstein family because a lot of this started because I had Casey Weinstein as a student officer professor at the Air Force Academy. I spent 20 years on active duty. I taught at the Air Force Academy on 2 separate occasions. And when I retired from active duty, I ended up getting a job at Colorado College, where I'm there now. And only in the last year or two, I've started to talk and write on this experience. So for those of you who've been kind of paying attention in the news media over the last 5 or 10 years about what's going on at the Air Force Academy, I'm not going to be rehashing stories that are out in the media. I'm going to be telling you about my personal experience. There's nothing I'm going to talk about that I wasn't physically there firsthand. And in this particular group, I'm not, going to say that a lot of what happened is because I was at the Air Force Academy. So I'll tell that story. And this is a presentation I gave to the CC faculty about 2 months ago. I may flip through some of these slides. This was designed to be about an hour, 15-minute talk. You give a professor 2 hours, they're going to talk for 2 hours and 10 minutes. So it's a small group. There's a lot of homogeneity in terms of how you're thinking about this issue. If there's something I say, you want to stop and ask questions, that's fine. I'll certainly pause as we go through. Does this work? All right. So I recently published a paper with the Center for Inquiry just about 2 months ago. And the talk that I'm giving tonight is a part of this. At the very end, I'll give you the web address if you actually wanted to see this. And if you just type my name, For God, Country, Center for Inquiry, this pops up. This is the first paper that's been written on this topic that's been outside the news media. I'm going to talk primarily, because we're in Colorado Springs, about my experience at the Air Force Academy. I'll spend a little bit of time to try to explain why what happened to the Air Force Academy did. It wasn't just necessarily a microcosm of some lunatic fringe. There's actually a national context in which this emerged. I'll talk about some of the things that are currently going on, and then as I talk about the paper, some of the conclusions and recommendations. You really can't talk about religious fundamentalism at the Academy until you go back to 2001. The Academy had been under a black cloud for quite a while. 2000, 2001, there were several congressional investigations looking at sexual harassment at the Air Force Academy. And there were an innumerable number of cases where women would come forward and say they were sexually harassed and raped. To the point where Tilly Fowler, a former member of Congress, was commissioned to write a report. And after that, they came out with this agenda for change in 2003. And they made some sweeping recommendations in what the Academy needed to do to change its personnel, change the culture in which the Academy was operating, and then also make some structural changes. And the biggest structural change they actually made dealt with 3 personnel. They did a clean sweep. They fired all the commanding officers. I don't know if you know who these people are, but in 2003, they brought in the first female to the Academy as a dean. She actually is now retiring this summer. They brought in a former Thunderbird and a rising one-star general to take over as commandant, and they brought in John Rosa, this general in the center. I'm going to be talking about these 3 because this was the chain of command at the Academy when I was actually there. But they brought them in, and the whole notion was, because of all of the sexual harassment problems we have, let's just get rid of everybody, bring in a new crew, and then we'll fix the problem. Well, we know that whenever you fix one thing, you typically break something else. And you can imagine, they did fix sexual harassment at the Academy to some extent, but in doing so, this was largely one of the catalysts of what actually unleashed this religious fundamentalism we saw at the Academy. All right, where do I fit in this picture? I actually went to the academy as a student. I was born and raised in Pueblo. I was a poor kid. I couldn't afford to go to college. And like so many people who end up in the military, it's a nice way they throw money at you. I went to the Air Force Academy. Spent 4 years there, graduated, and then I came back on faculty in the mid-90s. And the way they do, they bring in officers on faculty, you teach classes. After a couple of years, if they like you, they keep you, they send you back to grad school. I went back to grad school, and I was coming back to the academy with my doctorate. And the way the academy works is they want to make sure their academics don't get too academic. They need to make sure they re-blue you. So they don't want you to be in academia too long. They send you out to do an operational tour. I didn't want to be gone that long, so I said, I'll go anywhere you want to go, just minimize the time. And they ended up sending me to Israel for a 1-year overseas remote tour. My family stayed here. Israel was a profound experience for me for many reasons that you might imagine. One of the most profound experiences, well, aside from being away from my family, and we actually kicked off the war while I was there were only 2 of us in the country that were military, but there were a lot of embassy employees, civilian employees, and I really didn't have much of a chain of command to worry about. My boss, who was a lieutenant colonel, I was a major, he was from Haiti. He was a very open, free-thinking guy, like, do whatever you want. But I wanted to travel, and I found out the travel group was through the evangelical church group there. And the Israeli week went from Sunday through Thursday. So on Friday, Saturday was the weekend, and on Saturday you had church. And you could go to the Catholic service or you could go to the Christian service, because everybody knows Catholics are not Christian if you just ask the evangelicals. So I went there, and I grew up in a religious household. You know, I was an acolyte for many years. I mean, I was the typical traditional kid that goes into the military, straight, white, you know, Protestant Christian, you know. Of course, I loved Ronald Reagan and everything good about the Republican Party. So I was a product of this system. But what was so profound, this is the first time in my life I was a minority. I thought differently than people, I looked differently than people, I had different values, and I was embraced. And it was such an invigorating experience overall. But in going to this church service, I would go every Saturday. It was the first time that I really got to observe how a different part of society, a religious part of society, really thinks and feels. And this church that I would go to was absolutely fascinating. And what I had learned is, and again, there were no military in this group. I was the only military person there. They were all civilians working in the State Department. But they had felt so oppressed. Christians had felt so oppressed, evangelicals, for decades, because they never could really have a voice. Because it was, you know, against regulations of the State Department and certainly in the military. And it was thankfully for George Bush, he came out on scene and really gave them an opportunity to express themselves. So from their perspective, this was a great awakening, and it was a celebration. So you have this religious euphoria among this evangelical population, which I had not realized. And when I came back to the Air Force Academy, I just thought it was like it always was. I had been there as a cadet and then as a junior officer. But when I got back, it looked very, very different to me. And I liken it to the story of 2 fish that are swimming through the water. And there's a crab sitting on a rock. And the crab looks up at the fish and said, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And one fish looks at the other fish and says, "What the hell's water?" Okay. And when I was at the academy, I realized that nobody could see it for what it was. Two things happened in January, February 2004. First of all, I put this kid's picture up. This is Casey Weinstein. This was Mikey Weinstein's son. I did not know Mikey at the time. Casey was just a delightful young kid. This was his girlfriend at the academy. They'd now been married for about 5 or 6 years. But when I got back from Israel and I joined the faculty, I got invited to give a lot of talks at the academy. Everybody wanted to hear what it was like to be in Israel. And I talked to mostly religious organizations. But one of the groups that I talked to was a management course. And the guy said, "Jimmy, we want you to come talk about Israel to our international management class." I said, "Okay, kind of a big topic. You want to narrow that down a bit?" He said, "Yeah, keep it to 2 hours." That didn't help much. But at the end of that talk, and I typically start with, you want to understand Israel and what's going on in the Middle East, you got to go back 5,000 years with this guy named Abraham. He had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and you see the emergence of these 2 monotheistic religions. Afterwards, Casey comes up to me with one of his friends and said, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "I think in the vernacular I'm Gentile." I said, "Why do you ask?" He goes, "Man, that was the best lesson on Judaism we've ever had. We want to take a class from you." And I said, "Look, in the true spirit of Judaism, I'm going to push you away at least 3 times, go away." Well, he came back several times with two other friends, and they said, we really wanted to do some kind of independent study. And I said, what do you guys want to study? And they ended up picking a topic like this: Israeli security barrier is it a wall or a fence? Mildly interesting, and that's what they did. And we met in my office every other day at 8 o'clock for an hour. And it was at the academy, if you've got seniors that are really intellectually curious about anything, something is really going well or very badly, and I wasn't sure what it was. It was in February 2004. We sat down, we were talking about this book, Robert Fromkin's A Peace to End All Peace, about World War I post-1922, about why the Middle East is so messed up because of what the Balfour Declaration and we did. That's not the point. But they're real sullen. They don't want to talk. And I said, guys, what's wrong this morning? And they said, you didn't see what's going downstairs, did you? I said, no. They go, come with us. And we walked downstairs, and on the academic building at the academy, Fairchild Hall, on the third floor, there were these posters. And a little bit smaller than this. And there were hundreds of them, pasted all throughout the building. Now, at the academy, anybody go to the academy as a cadet? Okay. At the academy as a student, there are these spirit missions. The freshmen do things to kind of get everybody excited and build spirit. And they'll build a giant 19 out of cardboard boxes because they're 19 squadron. And then within an hour or two, they're cleaned up. Very common as part of the culture. This was couched as a spirit mission, but this is a professionally printed flyer by a movie theater, and they had help putting these up. I mean, I'd say thousands. I don't want to exaggerate, but it could have been thousands. Everywhere you look, as far as you can see, about 3 feet apart, there are these posters up. So we went back to my office and I said, guys, does this bother you? And he said, yeah, it really bothers us. And we started having a conversation why. And what I deduced is they started arguing amongst each other. It really bothered one kid, and the other kid said, you need to leave this alone. This is the problem. If you get out there and start complaining about things like this, people say you're just an angry Jew, and this is why they don't like us. So just shut up and let it go. And I sat back and I started to realize, wow, so the developmental process with religious minority cadets is to really toughen them up, develop that thick skin, and then they can just learn to take it. So I started asking more questions, and they said, guys, do you feel harassed here because you're Jewish? And one kid says, well, I'll give you an example. He said, so we're all going to pilot training, and we have to go to the shooting range in order to qualify the 9mm. And I'm getting ahead of my slides here, but that's okay. The 9mm, and we have to be at the base of the ramp, the Brigham Young ramp, which has since been renamed. And he said, so 16 of us get on this bus, and we're driving 5 miles away to the shooting range. We have to qualify with small arms. And as we're driving, the bus driver's got this evangelical talk radio station on. And he said, I found it offensive. So I walked up and said, sir, do you mind just turning it down or changing the channel? The bus driver slams on his brakes, opens the door in the middle of the athletic fields, miles away, and says, if you don't like it, get the hell off the bus. Kid just sits down, they shut the door, they drive on, radio stays on. As they're getting off the bus, the kids mustered the courage to address this. And he gets off and said, sir, if I may, I'd like to get your name. The bus driver grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil and says, you know what, cadet, give me your name. What's your AOC's name, your commanding officer? Why do I always have to get you people on my bus? I'll bet your daddy works for the ACLU. And I looked at him incredulously. I said, and when did this happen? He said, yesterday. Yesterday? And what happened? He said, well, I told my boss. I said, well, what did she do? He goes, I don't know. So I called her. And I said, what's going on? She goes, we'll address this. I won't belabor the story. 6 months goes by, the kids graduate, and Dave, the bus driver, is not addressed. When my boss finally gets involved in July, this happened in 6 months, they said, oh yeah, he finally retired. And I thought, well, that's odd. You let something go like that was harassing cadets. But what happened from that moment forward is I started asking them questions. And they said, guys, write things down for me and give it to me. And I'll try to find you ways of people to help you. Because I can't do anything with this. I'm just a major. Over the next several months, I started having all kinds of students coming in that would just tell me stories, and I have them documented, and I would send them to whoever those people might be. But that was a profound moment when Casey and these friends came forward. So I started doing a little reading, and I heard you mention the American United chapter. Barry Lynn's a good friend of mine. So one of the things that I did is I thought, you know what, we really need to have an open dialogue about religiosity in the military. So I invited Jay Sekulow. Jay, for those of you who don't know, runs the ACLJ, the American Center for Law and Justice. It's a plan of the ACLU, but they defend people's rights to express their religiosity in government. And they believe that we need more religion in government. Barry, of course, is on the other side of the fence, and he really is a strong advocate for anti-establishment. And what really complicates this matter at a military academy that's different than anywhere else is these kids live and work in the same place 24 hours a day. So there really is no off time. And the First Amendment is these 16 words. And it talks about establishment of religion, and in the same clause, free exercise. Well, for most people, you can say whatever you want in expression of religion, and you can swing your fist, but it ends at the tip of my nose. But when you're in a military context and a chain of command and you live there, this becomes very difficult to express your beliefs. And this is why so many Christians felt so voiceless because of this. So Barry and Jay actually came and we did that debate. And as we're starting to discuss this publicly, there's the bus ride I told, in the most incredulous story to really kind of capture what's going on there. And I've been now talking to cadets for probably 5 months. I walk into my office at 6:15 in the morning, and I keep a very clean office. There's a CD, a blank CD sitting in the middle of my desk that was not there when I left yesterday. It's like Mission Impossible. I'm thinking, okay, what is this? So I stick it in my computer, and I open it, and there's probably 50 text files and pictures and documents. And the very first one had an asterisk by it and said, please read first. And I opened it up, and it says, I hear you can be trusted. If this interests you, please call me. I signed his name. And I started opening up the documents, and the first one I opened up was a picture of a letter. And it was on letterhead with a flag and 3 stars. So in the military, it's a 3-star general writing this letter. And it was a letter of apology to this second-class cadet, a junior. Now, for those of you not in the military, 3-star generals do not apologize to cadets, ever, especially in writing. And I read it, says, I sincerely apologize for my behavior, it was unwarranted. It had signed his name, General so-and-so. So I was sufficiently intrigued to talk to this kid. So I pick up the phone, call his cadet in charge of quarters desk, and said, have him come see me. So about an hour later, he walks into my office, never met him before. He's 2 months from graduation. And he shows up with this folder of all of these documents printed. And as I look through here, he's got documentation that goes back 4 years, but he's been following one of these general officers. Johnny Whiteout was the commandant at the time. Most everything was about this particular officer because Johnny Whiteout was brought to the academy to fix the sexual harassment problem. And what they had reasoned is the cadets had lost their way, and they needed somebody with good moral character to come back and reset the moral compass of these cadets. And Whiteout was known amongst the general officers that he was a very principled human being, deeply religious, high moral values. He was the man. And he came. And what he had done over the next 4 years literally was incredulous. And I'm not going to get into the details, because this story is actually a much better story. So I'm looking through this, and I said, okay, we'll call the kid Tom. I said, so Tom, does this bother you? He goes, yes, it does. I said, well, I have to ask, how did you get a letter from the 3-star general apologizing to you? He said, well, last year, my class, 1,000 of us were sitting in Arnold Hall, the evening lecture hall, and the 3-star general, the superintendent, college president equivalent, was given a lecture, and he made the comment, there are no atheists in foxholes. He said, I'm an atheist, and that offended me. So I went to my commander, who's a major, and I told him that, I wanted to take issue with this up the chain of command. And my boss says, oh, dude, you're on your own, okay? If you want to go see the general on that one, that's fine. I'm not touching this one. So the kid, with the blessing of his commander, types an email. Dear General Gallagher, I felt offended, etc., and I think you need to apologize. I tell this story because this is not normal cadet behavior to any superior, especially a general. The general replied, and he wrote him this nice letter. The other part of that story is when he got the letter, the kid replied, got your letter, thanks, General, not good enough. You insulted me in front of 1,000 of my classmates. I think you should make the apology public. Of course, the general never replied. That general, that 3-star, was actually fired with the agenda of change because he was part of this culture of sexual harassment. So he's gone out of the picture, and We brought in Johnny White, who's the acting superintendent until the 3-star gets here. So you've got this rabid evangelical general officer that has done some really incredible things that I talk about in the paper. This kid, Tom, is sitting in front of me. I said, so Tom, there's 2 things you can do. Number 1, you can go to the Military Equal Opportunity Office. And their job is to address claims much like yours. Or you can go to the Inspector General, the IG. And the IG will investigate any complaint. He said, well, what do you suggest? I said, well, given the nature of this claim, I would go to the NEO. And let me tell you something. We had a ceremony 2 weeks ago. They got the whole faculty and staff together. 2,000 of us went into Arnold Hall while our NEO officer, a captain, got the award as the best NEO officer in the Air Force. Got this big award, we clapped. So I don't know him, but he's obviously really good. Okay. So I pick up the phone, I call him, didn't know who the guy was. I don't want to say his name, but Captain so-and-so, this is Major Parco. I've got this student here, he's got some claims about religious harassment that he'd like to address. Can I send him over? Yeah, please send him over. Great. So I give Tom the where to go, and he leaves. About an hour goes by. He's not your typical cadet. I'm in my office. He walks in, slams the door, uses an expletive, points his finger at my face and said, "You set me up." And I'm just looking at him. I said, "Why don't you sit down? What are you talking about?" He said, "You haven't set me up." He is angry. I've never seen behavior from a cadet like this. But I was intrigued that he was actually acting in such a way. And I knew there was something else going on. I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You really don't know, do you?" I said, "I have no idea, but trust me, this is a strange day for both of us." He said, "Well, I did what you told me." I walked over to his office, knocked on his door, and sat down. And I introduced myself, and I said, Major Parco sent me over, but I've been tracking a lot of these cases that have been happening. I'm an atheist cadet. This is overt religious influence, and I find it offensive. I'd like to get redress. The captain reaches across his desk, takes it from the cadet, is looking at it, sets it down and says, "You know what, we can address this, but I have to tell you, as a Christian, this breaks my heart that you left the flock, and I think we first need to have a conversation about bringing you back to life in Christ." So the kid grabs the packet. If anybody told me the story, I wouldn't believe him, but I was there. So he grabs the packet, comes back to my office, and he's telling me this. I said, "Look, Tom, I know you graduate in 2 months. I know you would not be lying to me and risk your graduation, but you have to understand, I have to make a phone call here." He said, "Please." So I pick up the phone, dial the guy, "Captain so-and-so, this is Major Parco. I've got the cadet back in my office. He just told me that you couldn't help him." He said, "Oh no." He said, I didn't tell him that, but it just really broke my heart to hear that he's an atheist, and if you're a good Christian, you'll talk to him too." Click. Okay, so I said, your only other option now is to talk to the Inspector General. So I pick up the phone.
Jim, which is higher, major or captain?
So it's lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel. So I outrank him, so I'm a major at the time. But the guy that I called the Inspector General is a lieutenant colonel, so he's one step above me. Call the IG, said, "Look, I've got a cadet in my office. He's got a pretty incredulous story. Can I send him over?" "Sure, I'm in my office." Tom comes back, see I'm sleeping. Tom, shut the mic, yeah. Tom comes back, sits down, and says, and he's smiling. I said, "So everything good?" He said, "Not really." He said, "They won't take it." I said, "What do you mean they won't take it?" He goes, "They won't take my complaint." He said, "I've been in the military 16 years. The IG takes all complaints. That's what they do. So they won't take mine." Okay. So I pick up the phone. I call him. I said, "Colonel so-and-so," I said, "Major Parco." So he's in my office. He said, "You won't take the complaint." He said, "That's right." Okay, so I've been in the military 16 years. I've never heard of the IG not taking the complaint. You want to tell me why? He said, "Well, yes, he's making an allegation against a general officer. That has to be handled in the Pentagon." "Did you tell him that?" He didn't ask. I said, "Well, I'm asking." So he gives me the phone number. So I hang up the phone. I said, "So it turns out you have to actually call the Pentagon. Are you willing to do that?" He said, "Absolutely." So I hand him the phone. And I dial the number, and he's sitting there. "Sir, can you press 1? 3? 2. So hang up the phone, hang up, and I hang it up. And I just pick up the phone. I don't ask him. I just pick up the phone and I dial. And I go through the little prompts, 1, 3, etc. And then I get to this message. And it's something like, you have reached the Inspector General's office of the Department of Defense. Be advised under Article something of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you are making a complaint against a general officer. If that claim is found not to be substantiated, you can be held criminally liable. If you'd like to continue, press 1.
Continue.
So I ended up having a talk with a colonel out there, and he finally was able to get it. But I tell this story because what I started to see right away was it was more than just people wanting to express themselves. A structure had started to develop at the Air Force Academy that allowed this to exist. And what you have to recognize in the military, nobody has voice. When you sign up in the military, you take the oath, you obey the chain of command. And if you have a grievance, you address it to the chain of command. If you have an issue with your chain of command, you go to places like the IG or the MEO. And when you have problems there, there really is no place else to turn. So this is where I started to get much more interested. This individual here, when I started going through some of the documentation that the cadet brought me, he wrote guidance, and here are just some examples where he sent a letter out to all the cadets when he was the acting superintendent, the acting guy in charge. And the guidance was, as cadets, you have to pay homage first to God, then to your country, and finally to your classmates. And this really bothered a lot of cadets to say, wait, I thought first of all we pay homage to the Constitution because that's what we give our oath. But what I found most interesting was a story that the cadet told to me that we found out later was actually true. When he first got to the academy, he went on a religious retreat with fourth classmen. Fourth classmen are freshmen. Okay. They call them maggots in the cadet culture because they are the lowest life form with the potential to fly. So these are cadets that someday will be pilots, but they really have no rank, they have nothing. They get a chance to go off base at this religious retreat, run by the chaplains, and they invite the one-star general, who's the highest ranking member of the organization. And here's what he does. He tells them the story of the 2 men who built houses out of the Bible. One built their house on the sand, one built their house on the rock. You heard this story before? For those who are shaking your head, know it's like the 3 little pigs, except Bible style. And the whole point of the story is build your house on the rock being symbolic of Christ, and you can weather all the storms. So he tells the story, and then he tells them, every time I appear publicly to the cadet wing, I'm going to yell, air power, and you're to reply, rock, sir, and you'll reflect on this parable. Now, people aren't going to know what that means, but when they ask you, that is then your opportunity to bear faith to our Lord and Savior Christ. And I would actually be in the dining hall with 4,000, ladies and gentlemen, commandant cadets, room 10 shut, air power, and you hear, up, sir, with some voices, and you think, what the hell was that? Right? And at ease. But he started to put, and Americans United actually did a report in 2005 that goes into great detail in cases like this, and they really found that he was doing some absolutely egregious things. And I'll tell you the most egregious here in just a second. So this is John Rosa. Rosa came to the academy about 6 months after White had been in charge. John White was a 1-star general, and John Rosa was a 3-star general. He's his boss. He's the superintendent, the president. The 1-star is the commandant. And he had been there probably about 3 or 4 months when, he'd been there probably 3 or 4 weeks when a lot of this had really started coming to his desk. To the point where one afternoon, right before, it was probably in May or June, he walks in my office. And I've never seen a 3-star general in our building, let alone on our floor and certainly in my office. Generals don't talk to majors. And he sits down and he introduces himself. It's like, I know who you are, General. And he said, well, I need some advice. And at this point, all the alarms go off. And I said, General, in all due respect, in my experience, when senior leaders ask for advice, they're really asking for validation. So I have no idea what you're asking me to do. And he looks at me and he said, you know what? That's my experience too. He said, but I really do want some feedback from you. So we had a really nice conversation, about 45 minutes, about all the things that needed to happen to help kind of change the system. It wasn't just a one-shot fix. He gives a lecture at the end of Defamation League, months, weeks later actually, and much of what he was articulating were things that we had talked about. He was an outsider. He did not go to a military academy. He did not go to the Air Force Academy. He didn't go to ROTC, but he actually went to the Citadel. But people saw him as this outsider. Well, his response to what the military's most response is if there's a problem, we'll just train it away. So what they started doing is, we've got this religious intolerance problem, we're going to start conducting training. And they put this RSVP together, respecting the spiritual values of persons, was the bumper sticker. And it turns out it actually started out quite nicely. They had the Catholic priest and the Lutheran minister put together a 90-minute presentation, and they were going to train all the cadet commanders, all the officers who were in charge of the cadets and the senior NCOs. And they started talking about religious traditions from the Far East and Shinto, and they talked about Native American traditions. And when I saw an earlier version, I thought, you know what? This is somewhat diverse. It's a good first step. And of course, when I asked that, we don't really have any groups here that are like a free-thinking group. Have you ever thought about incorporating some aspect of just secularism? And I remember the colonel in charge looked at me and said, that's just a stupid idea. And that was the end of that. But anyway, they put this training into place. And the plan was they were going to train all of these officers and cadets, about 300 people. And they did. This was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Tuesday before Thanksgiving, in 2004. And in the room, you had two lecterns like this, where you had the two chaplains. You had a couple of screens like this, and in the room you have 300 people. And they invited the management department, which I was part of, along with about 4 or 5 others that we had been kind of involved with this. And in the very front, you had the 3-star general, the dean, 1-star general, and the commandant, a 1-star general. And then over here on the side, you had the vice commandant. She was one of the first female graduates of the academy that the Agenda for Change brought in to kind of embrace women. And she was there for sexual harassment, but she had kind of had to take control of this whole religious intolerance. And then you have the head chaplain. The head chaplain is also a colonel who works for the 3-star general. So everybody here works for the 3-star general. They do the little presentation, and we thought, you know what, this is a good first start. And then they started having Q&A. And it's the typical questions after a presentation. It's just not a lot there until the last question. There was a student on the very far side, and the lights were pretty low, and I couldn't see him. But he stood up and said, I have a question. And it's the head chaplain and the vice commandant who have the microphones. And he said, ma'am, I have a question. Can we have Bible studies in cadet TV rooms? Now let me explain. The way the academy is organized, there are 40 cadet squadrons, 100 cadets in a squadron. And every squadron has a common use room. And there's a TV in there. It's the only TV in the squadron, so anybody can go in there to do whatever they want and watch TV. And his question was, can we have a Bible study in there? It was the only question that had any kind of behavioral implications. And I remember the vice commandant stood there with a microphone, and she just did this. She had no idea to answer this question. The chaplain grabbed the microphone and said, I'll answer that. It's actually a very good question. This is what he said. He said, here at the Academy, we're blessed to have a plethora of resources for religious expression. We have the chapel, Protestant upstairs, Catholic downstairs. We have an all-faith room in the back, a Buddhist room, and also a Jewish synagogue. Over inside John Hall, one of the dormitories, the whole 3rd floor is reserved for common use rooms, for youth groups, etc. And in each cadet group, there's 4 of them with each 10 squadrons, we have a dedicated chaplain with a conference room. So given the availability of resources for spiritual expression, it'd probably be inappropriate to disenfranchise a common use room for that purpose. Which, as you're sitting thinking, on the fly, that's a really good answer. Mm-hmm. At that moment, the 1-star rabid evangelical general stands up, grabs the microphone from the colonel, looks at the audience and says, I'll give some guidance there. You want to do a Bible study in the cadet TV room? Yeah, it's not a problem. Hands the microphone back and sits down.
Wow.
Dead silence in the room. And later, John Rosa said that was the mistake that he made because he allowed his 1-star general crush his chaplain. And within a matter of 5 days, it became public, and everybody in Colorado Springs started reading Pam Zubek's articles on all that was going on at the Air Force Academy. So that's what happened there as I saw this. And over the course of my 4 years there, I actually left at the end of 4 years. I was supposed to stay my whole career, but surprisingly I ended up going to Montgomery, Alabama for my remaining 4 years. Just on normal rotation cycles, as they tell me. important, though, to look at the academy, because the academy, for all of this going on, really does produce exactly what it wants to produce. I mean, these are cadets that can do lots of things. They can work 18 hours a day, do 14 things at once. They're very loyal, they're very obedient. They're great performance. Every system's perfectly designed to yield the behaviors observed. So when you look at these cadets, it's exactly what they're developing, and they had actually built this in. But what's really important is to look at this national political context. And I told you when I was in Israel, going to the embassy church services, how the evangelicals really felt empowered. So I started doing some research, and this is something that does not get enough press. But I found this memo. Did you know June 10th is Jesus Day? Becky, did you know this?
I have no clue.
I can send you a copy of this document. So this is actually something that George Bush signed when he was governor of Texas. So it's just in the state of Texas. Throughout the world, people of all religions recognize Jesus Christ as an example of love, compassion, sacrifice, and service. So to honor his life and teachings, we're making June 10th Jesus Day. I was shocked that this never made the news. Anybody ever talked about this? But I was paying attention, because being in the military, you start to get politically involved. You never express your political views, but you watch. And I remember this debate. Do you remember Gore versus Bush?
Yes, I remember.
Of course this group remembers this. For those of you who don't remember this who are too young, the moderator asked the candidates, tell us who your favorite philosopher is. And I can remember what Al Gore said. I think he said Mother Teresa. I used to actually work at the White House. I worked for Al Gore. And on his wall he had a picture of Earth and he had a picture of Mother Teresa. But he gave a nice answer. But George Bush, and this was the moment that the election, everything turned. This was his quote. But he said, it's Jesus Christ. And this is what this oppressed population of Christians, evangelical Christians, had been waiting for, and it just galvanized the support. And from this point forward, well, except for hanging Chad in Florida, it was George Bush's election. What we have to remember, though, this really isn't about politics. This is about the military. And the president is also the commander-in-chief of the armed services. Everybody in the nation's paying attention, but everybody in the military is paying attention. And all of these oppressed evangelicals, who really felt they never could express themselves, took this, that now's my chance. But the point is this, nobody in the military has voice. I don't care who you are, you have to stay in the chain of command. Anybody know who this guy is? This is Jerry Boykin. He now works he's the vice president for the Family Research Council. At the time, he was an undersecretary for the Department of Defense. And he was giving a briefing in 2003 about Somalia. And in his briefing, he points at this picture. There's a dark image, probably a piece of lint on the camera or something. But he said, that is a demonic presence that God has revealed to me. The city is under siege, and we will go after them because we know that our God is bigger than their God. And when Otto was actually captured, months later, he went to jail. And he said, and your God's no match for ours. Let me remind you, he was an Under-Secretary of Defense. When we invaded Iraq, and this is all in the paper if you're interested, briefings went every morning to the Strategic Council, the President, Secretary of Defense, etc. And this is the daily intelligence brief of what's going on. A two-star general, who I think was the director of intelligence, started putting pictures on the front of these with Bible quotes. And one general in the room asked a question after about a week to say, is this really appropriate that we're invading Iraq and we're using quotes from the New Testament as some motivational image on the front of the top secret report? They said, yeah, that's what the boss wants. And they're referring to Donald Rumsfeld, not Bush. That's what the boss wants. The reply from this two-star general is this. And again, the things I've talked about in the paper, if you're interested, all the documents are there and you can actually do your own research and decide for yourself. What I tell my students at CC, believe nothing I tell you. Okay? You have to judge for yourself. Yes, sir?
The guns have Bible quotes on them.
We'll get there. Not quite yet. And it's not just the chain of command, it's the chaplaincy. It's gone to court. They've found over and over and over the chaplaincy is constitutional because it has nothing to do with religion. It's a way for chaplains to minister to the spiritual well-being of everybody, irrespective of faith or no faith. Well, so I'll show you two slides. First of all, let me introduce you to Cecil Richardson. Cecil Richardson was the head chaplain of the Air Force. His predecessor, Charlie Baldwin, when they were doing the RSVP training, came to look at that training that I said was actually pretty good, the training he actually gave wasn't so good. Because when he looked at it, after 90 minutes, he looked at the two chaplains and says, how come the Christians are always losing? He said, take all this nonsense about the Jews and the Shinto Native Americans out, make it more Christian. And they had a bunch of Mel Gibson clips. And that's what we actually saw. It was still very emotional, but it was clearly a Christian bias. Well, he starts getting interviewed. And in General Order 1B, when you're deployed, it says you can't eat pork, you can't drink in Muslim countries, etc., but you also cannot proselytize. These are things that our government said you do not do because it's not good for our national best interest. Well, they were talking to him in the New York Times, interviewing him, and they were talking about, well, isn't that exactly what this evangelical force is doing there? He says, oh, no. We do not proselytize, but we do reserve the right to evangelize the unchurched. And this was on the front page of C section of New York Times in 2008. Well, he was interviewed not long after by an Air Force Times reporter, and the Air Force Times reporter went back to that quote and said, John Richardson, is that what you really meant? Did you really mean we reserve the right to evangelize the unchurched? Because it sounds to me that's a lot like forcible coercion. I mean, not everybody really may want to have your religion forced upon them. And this exchange goes for back and forth 3 or 4 times, and he finally says, you know what? Sometimes people just need Jesus. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, is the highest level of the chain of command within the chaplaincy. And people take notice. The society was taking notice, the military leaders are taking notice, and the chaplains are taking notice. And here's what really concerns me. When you look at the demographics, and this is a very contentious slide, I know when I show it, I always get people yelling at me for very different reasons because it doesn't say exactly what they wanted to say. But here's for the effect, when you look at the general population, about 2/3 identify as being religious, okay? Roughly a 4th say no religious preference. Down here are the minority faith groups. But when you look here, pay attention to the pink here, or the red. In the general population, less than a 5th identify as evangelical Christian. But when you look at military chaplains, it's not 2/3 that are Christian. 98% of chaplains are Christian. And of those, 2/3 are evangelical. 2 things happened in the course of the Reagan administration that I want to point out. Does anybody know where Ronald Reagan's from?
Iowa.
No, he's from Illinois.
Ronald Reagan, California, governor of California.
He was born
Yeah, maybe born somewhere else, but he was governor of California. Now, you're the governor of California, or have been recently, and you're going to run for president of the United States. Where might you think would be a great place to announce your candidacy for president? How about Grenville, Arkansas? Oh. Nobody ever talks about this. Why did Ronald Reagan announce his presidency in Grenville, Arkansas? I'll tell you why. Because during the 1970s, they recognized that this whole segregation thing was still in place. The idea of integrating because of the civil rights movement was not working in the South. And the federal government, starting under Kennedy and then under Johnson, says, we're going to fix this. And they started doing the cross-busing. Remember the cross-busing? And you had freedom rides. People from the North would come down to the South and get on these buses to support these cross-busing trips. What people don't know, that during the fever pitch of this whole fight against segregation, Grenville, Arkansas has a very strong KKK contingent there. And there were 3 murders. It was a black guy and 2 Jewish guys. They were on the freedom rides. And after that, it kind of put an end to the whole cross-busing thing there because people, quite frankly, just got scared. Ronald Reagan, according to historians, most likely announced his candidacy in Grenville, Arkansas, because up until that point, the South always voted Democrat. You always saw the South. Jimmy Carter, right? It was always, you ever wonder why the South states all of a sudden went red? This is why. When Reagan announced his candidacy in Grenville, Arkansas, it was kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod to say, look, you elect a Republican as a president, we'll put an end to this cross-busing nonsense. And that year, the entire South went for Reagan. And since then, it's all been red. That's the first thing. The second thing of the Reagan administration, and I haven't written this paper yet, this is not in the paper, but I'm working on this. The second thing that happened is they actually changed the requirements in the military of how you can become a military chaplain. You have to be ordained by some ecumenical institution, and then they can admit you. Well, under Reagan, they changed the requirements to where just about any evangelical church could be ordained. And you saw this massive switch under Reagan in this tremendous growth of evangelical chaplains. So it started under Reagan and kind of persisted under Bush. But you see the chaplain demographics had actually changed. And now we get to talk about all the fun things that you have been reading about that I don't have firsthand. These aren't firsthand stories. But as I look at this, you don't actually see a lot of poetry books on colonels' desks. But you see a lot of Bibles. And you always have. And about this time, the Bible started having camouflage covers. I remember asking questions like, what's with the camouflage cover? It's like, oh, it just kind of cool matches the uniform. Okay, fair enough. But I don't see Chaucer on your desk with a camouflage cover. And then they started putting out these Bibles. And this was done, in mass and being distributed. We're actually using official government seals putting on the Bible. This was brought to light, and there was a lot of hem-hum, but they stopped doing this. Here's another problem. When you look at these military ministries, they target two populations. They target the military and they target prisons. Any guess as to why? They're captive audiences. Even to this day, as recently as 2 months ago, I was talking to a student. The shepherding movement, and I think it's run by the Navigators, I'm not sure, but they actually have Bible studies where you actually have men and women that are separated for the Bible study. And they tell the young ladies, it's okay you're in the military, we understand you might want a career, but you have to realize you need to get out as soon as you can, get married and raise children, and follow your husband. To this day, we still have this kind of rhetoric going on the idea of religious expression. And the military has been very, very open to this. When you expose light on it, it comes down for a while, but it's still there. It really doesn't go away. We like to talk to him. We like to have thought of him as Saint David. The kind of the patriarch saint of the military. People really revered this guy. But I always had a bit of an issue. He had a chaplain, Brett Causey. It was his head chaplain in Afghanistan. His head chaplain wrote this in the Baptist Press in November 2011. It was incredible. He's talking about under Dave Petraeus' staff, under ICAF, it was incredible to see the growth of Bible studies and the growth of conversions among our own service people. Not just the battlefield conversations, but the maturity of faith and development of mentorship at all levels. And this is the key. We started out with 4 of us in Bible study, and when I left, 85% of our leadership were active in dynamic Bible study. 18 out of 22 Petraeus' directorates, his direct reports. It's always an impact when anyone comes to Christ as Savior, but I saw guys age 45 and above making first-time commitments to Christ, and at least 40% of service people were taking chapel. If your boss says, I think it's a good idea if you go to church, where are you going? Okay? And you see this again at all levels, and yet we revere guys like Petraeus, and he gets away with it. A guy named Jeff Sharp wrote an article in Harper's Magazine, and he was the first to really expose what was going on. One of the articles, he actually went to Baghdad and actually saw that inscription right here, and that basically painted on the Bradley fighting vehicles says, Jesus killed Muhammad. And they're driving these vehicles through these Iraqi towns. Now remember, we're in a war amongst the people, we're trying to win the hearts and minds. Okay? But this is how we're doing it. Then while they were putting the translator on the road with the bullhorn shouting in Arabic, Jesus killed Muhammad, training American guns on anybody who responded, the Bradley fighting vehicle rolled out of the city of Samara, drawing fire everywhere it went, leading the special forces to conclude that every single Iraqi who took offense at these words, Jesus killed Muhammad, was part of the enemy, and therefore needed to be destroyed. Charlotte also, with this is I find interesting, interviewed John Redney, the superintendent that came after John Rosa. And he started talking to him, just kind of interviewing him, and he said, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the First Amendment, on how you see reconciliation between the free establishment, or the free exercise and the Establishment Clause. And I kid you not, the 3-star general said, I need to get a piece of paper. Can you tell me what those constitutional things are again? But we're bringing people in that really have no idea what they're charged to. Another example. Anybody heard of Tragicon, the Jesus Rifles? Have you heard of this story? Okay, for those of you shaking your head no, I'll say it quickly. Here's a company that had a $600 to $800 million contract with the Army and the Marine Corps, making rifle sights that would go on the weapons that we were used in the deployed site. And on these sights, they would actually put Bible verses. And when it finally came to light, Mikey Weinstein's Military Religious Freedom Foundation wrote this with ABC News. you'd actually see these. They finally canceled the contract and started replacing the sites. But we were literally shooting at Iraqis and Afghanis with sites that had Bible quotes on it. And of course, the people that ran and owned Trajecon were evangelical Christians. Here's a fun one. This actually happened at Vandenberg Air Force Base. For 20 years, we send our young cadets and officers to nuclear missile training, and these are the kids that are going to turn the keys if we ever give the order. They have something called, what do they call this? It was nuclear ethics. Now this is Bernard von Braun. He was a former Nazi, and they use him as the example of moral leadership. But in this training, they're telling people that when you're making the decision to launch nuclear weapons, we need to think about what Christ would do. Because it takes somebody of high moral character to be in the military and have a position like this, and if you're not religious, we know you can't have any morals, and therefore you can't be there. Well, when this finally came to light, the Secretary, or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Norty Schwartz, says, we are stopping this training, run by the chaplains. And he required every military organization to distribute this letter as soon as possible. And it happened at bases throughout the world, except for one. Any guess which base? So you've seen the sign. So the Military Religious Freedom Foundation actually got the sign over on Garden of the Gods Road that actually put the letter by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force so all people at the Air Force Academy could actually see the letter. The institution refused to distribute this. And 3 days after they put the sign up, the letter got distributed. Again, there's a culture to really preserve what they're actually doing. One of the most profane examples, and then I'll stop after this and take questions, because I don't want to go too long. We've been going almost an hour now. It's an organization called the Christian Embassy. This is probably the most profane piece of evidence that I was able to capture. It was only up for a little while before it was identified, then it went down. The Christian Embassy sounds like a quasi-government organization. It's based in DC, but their mission is exclusively to get people in the ways of Jesus Christ into the highest levels of government. And they were able to get active duty military and very senior civilians to go on tape and minister to others that was really part of their official government duties. I hope the volume's loud enough.
Run, run, run. When the bells ring, you drop everything, you go to the floor and vote. And the pressures of this place can at times overwhelm you. On the Hill, Christian Embassy comes to us.
The Christian Embassy really gives us a tremendous opportunity here at the Pentagon as leaders that carry a lot of responsibility on our shoulders on a daily basis to stop and reflect, and to come together with others who are in a similar walk of life and carry similar responsibilities and realize we've got a need for the Lord in our lives.
I wish my people back home in my country to realize how important it is to connect their lives to Jesus. I want to start a kind of group similar to this one back home in Romania.
What's important to me is in the context of our work here in the Pentagon is to get together with other believers and be encouraged, and it makes such a big difference.
Through my relationship with Christian Embassy, my eyes were opened to the fact that even though I was a sinner, Jesus Christ is a very forgiving God, and all I have to do is accept Him as my Savior. And He died on the cross for me personally, that He paid my debt in full. And it makes me cry. It's very exciting.
Christian Embassy comes alongside presidential appointees serving in the White House and federal agencies to help direct their focus on Jesus Christ.
The Christian Embassy has been there and has been a rock that I can rely on.
Secretary of the Army.
Been an organization that helped me in my walk with Christ, and I'm just thankful for the service they give. It's a wonderful ministry that touches the lives of a lot of folks who have great needs.
Like many other appointees, Undersecretary Dan Cooper makes time in his pressing schedule for a weekly Bible study.
It's not a matter of carving out time. It really is a matter of saying what is important. And since that's more important than doing the job's going to be there, whether I'm there or not.
These are tough jobs. They're demanding jobs. When I heard that we were on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I heard that, I understood it, but now I'm living it. I can't imagine doing this without the Lord. The Christian Embassy is here, is interested in helping not only me in my position, but other senior political appointees. Is not only reassuring and refreshing, but it's essential. I don't know of any other organization that would get up, come into my office 6:15 in the morning to have a Bible study.
I know everybody, because they work for you.
There are over 25,000 Department of Defense leaders working in the rings and corridors of the Pentagon. Through Bible studies, discipleship, prayer breakfasts, and outreach events, Christian Embassy is mustering these men and women into an intentional relationship with Jesus Christ.
See the camouflage Bible?
These godly men are taking godly principles that they're learning in the Christian Embassy Bible studies, and they're applying those things to their personal life.
I want to show you one more
And
guy.
as a result, they're going to go out and they're going to lead men.
You gotta see
Their
this.
soldiers are going to benefit from the fact that they are military men that are also godly men.
Generals and admirals meet regularly for the Flag Officer Fellowship.
This guy right here.
I see a brother in the Lord in these flag fellowship groups, and I immediately feel like I'm being held accountable because we're the aroma of Jesus Christ.
I'll stop there. He is the incoming superintendent of West Point, taking command next month. So when people hear me give this talk, they say, Jim, you're talking about things that happened a bunch of years ago at the Air Force Academy. You're just stirring up old news. This isn't an issue. I'd make an argument this is a profound and clear and present danger, because when you look at the highest level of military leadership and you see this Christian Embassy video, I mean, this is a testament to exactly what's going on outside the wall.
Yeah, I think,
Thank you very much. Jim Parco.
If you want to talk, Becky, take a stand. You're up here once for a little bit.
What-
Rob, Becky, thank you.
thank you.
Nice talking to everybody.
You too.
Great presentation.
I agree with a lot of what you